Well, good afternoon. I'm Paul Bolls, and around the journalism school, I'm known as the nerdy mad scientist because I hook people's brains up to media and have all kinds of fun doing it. You'll hear about that in just a minute in my talk. But where we're headed with this portion of the session is this talk is going to be a little bit different than maybe some of the things you've already heard today, because this talk is more about research approach and understanding research at a little deeper level. More specifically, from my expertise, it's understanding the brain on media. One of the things that I do around the journalism school is I co-direct a lab called the Prime Lab. Brad kind of gave the long-winded meaning of that acronym a minute ago, psychological research on information media effects. You know, academics love long titles. So you have to take a deep breath to get that out. But basically, it's a way of saying it's where we study what people's brain does with media and when individuals are interacting with media in real time. And I think that's a valuable piece of information to have when you're thinking about news audience. And I think before we kind of roll on here, I think a big point that you've got to understand with how I view things is that whenever you're thinking about research of any kind, web analytics or any kind of data stream, you have to first and foremost be thinking about, what does that data tell me? That's question number one. And what does that data not tell me about the audience that I might need to know to make some pretty important organizational decisions? So let's take a look at web analytics in terms of understanding the news audience and what analytics, from my perspective as someone who studies kind of media psychology, the brain on media, what web analytics tell you in terms of insight and what they don't tell you. I would say that web analytics provide great data on behavior. Web analytics is all about behavior because that's the information source that's going into creating that data stream. Behavior, people's actions online. That's the information stream. That's what it's telling you. And it does a great job telling you about that. If you think back to Edson's talk and you looked at those metrics, those were online behaviors. Page view, click-through, duration on a page, bounce rate. That's behavioral data. But you also have to ask that second question, what's the data not telling you? And at a big picture level, I would say web analytics tells you zero or next to zero about the brain that is producing that behavior. And I think that's where news organizations need to go in order to optimize news content. So here's another example of a big concept in web analytics. Anyone want to work that formula out for me real quick for your own websites? Pretty complex. Pretty rich data, all kinds of interesting indexes here. Click depth, recency index, duration, brand index, feedback, loyalty index, subscription index, all kind of indices, all telling you something about user behavior. All worked into a formula that we're going to call engagement. And here's another second point that I'd make, a big picture point from the perspective of someone who looks at the brain on media. And I need to define that. This is only from kind of my nerdy mad science media psychology perspective. From the perspective of someone who studies the brain on media, I would say that one place the industry has gotten off track in even thinking about engagement is basically the way it operationally gets defined is by some kind of descriptive behavior. And engagement is a much richer phenomenon, I would argue. Much richer mental phenomenon that occurs in the brain that's processing that website. And so I think that's where you have to go. And so in terms of that gap, web analytics is, in my mind, a lot like traditional media effects research, which was indeed focused on behavior. And traditional media effects research really treated that brain and that mind as this mysterious black box that you couldn't observe, you couldn't penetrate. We can't observe that, so we're going to measure behavior and focus on the effects of media. And I think that's what web analytics does. It gives you the effect. It gives you very good data about the effect of content on behavior. But understand that that's leaving a knowledge gap. That's leaving a big knowledge gap in understanding the effects of content and website design on individuals. This approach is great, and I think this applies to web analytics. Web analytics are great, like this approach, to answering what I would call what questions. The what question. What effect did our website design have on individuals and users? It's great at that, because it's an effect. That's what an effect is. It answers the what question. But to dig deeper than that what question, you have to dig inside that black box. And one way to do that, and this is how we do it in the Prime Lab, is through an evolved science called psychophysiology. Psychophysiology, or media psychophysiology, which is the science of psychophysiology applied to studying how people process media, is basically, to put it simply, without making this a grad seminar on media psychophysiology, which I'm sure you all would appreciate, if you want to attend that Monday at 11, just in the room down the hall, by the way. But to put it simply, psychophysiology is really, in essence, just the science of the embodied mind. It makes a fundamental assumption, first and foremost, that Descartes was wrong. You can't separate mind and body. The mind is an embodied phenomenon, embodied in a very real physical organ called the brain. And as an individual interacts with content on a website, that brain is doing stuff, processing information. And in the process of processing information, that occurs at an embodied level throughout the nervous system. And now there are ways of observing those specific patterns in human nervous system activity that tell us something about what that brain is doing when they're on your website. That's what psychophysiology science brings to the table, is measures that burst open that black box and get inside the mind. So this was what I would argue is a much more useful research paradigm. The media psychophysiology paradigm, obtaining insight from holistically looking across data streams. I'm not discounting web analytics, because behavior is critically important to understand. I'm just saying it's only giving you part of the picture, and that you need to go deeper to understand audience experience. So what I'm arguing for is an approach that combines psychophysiological science with web analytics. Not an exactly novel idea. Let's just put two things together to get something better, right? And I would say that that's what is going to really yield user experience insight that organizations can use to optimize content. There's another piece of information, critical information, that web analytics doesn't do particularly well at capturing, is even just the very nature of how individuals interact with media stimuli, media content. People who study how the brain processes media understand media consumption, first and foremost, as an across-time experience. More specifically, across-time dynamic experience, consisting of what, kind of in the, pardon the nerdy academic terms, what consists of both feed-forward and feed-backward processes, all occurring simultaneously, because that's how the human brain processes information. The human brain is not a linear processor. No duh point of the day is that people don't come to your website as a blank slate. They're bringing all kinds of previous experiences with them that they're using to, in a very time-driven manner, drive their responses to your website. So it's an interaction. That's why we call it interactive media. But you got to apply that definition to even what the brain is doing when they're on your website. And so I would argue that really what this approach does, by combining psychophysiological data, what the brain is actually doing, with that behavioral data, we can really get a deeper understanding of effects by, instead of just asking the what question, adding on to it the ability to ask the how and the why questions. How are individuals experiencing my website? Why are they bouncing sooner than we'd like them to? Why does nobody want to advertise on my website? Why aren't my users responding to the ads that are placed in that content? We think they like video, so we throw a lot of video links on the website. But are they really getting smarter about the world around them? Is that achieving a positive effect? To understand those questions, you have to ask the how and why about user experience. And so, getting to this point about understanding what data tells you and what it doesn't, you also have to understand what every kind of measure is measuring and what it isn't. So here's my proposition. I would say that what you're capturing with web analytics is literally this interaction right here. Conscious and phenomenological experience that people have with web content and the resulting behavior. And then maybe how that behavior feeds back into conscious experience. That's the part of user experience that you're capturing right there. You're not capturing that, the whole thing. There's a whole lot going on when a user is on your website. The myth of a lazy processor, people being lazy, is just that. It's a myth. The brain does a whole lot with media. Any kind of media. And so you got to capture multiple processes that are going on when individuals are on a website. So here's how we conceptualize what measures tell you. I gave you what analytics tell you. Here's what we're doing in the Prime Lab. We're using eye tracking to measure just simply perceptual sensory processing. Obviously, visual sensory processing, because it's eye tracking. That's it, period. That's all we're saying eye tracking data tells you. So if you've read eye tracking reports, or if your organization has had eye tracking research done, look critically at what the organization that provided that research to you is telling you it measures. Because what we're saying, really all eye tracking data tells you, end of story, is visual perceptual attention. Where the eyes go. In essence, it provides a sensory window into the brain. Period. That's it. To understand what happens in the brain behind that visual perception, you've got to dig deeper and get measures of this stuff. What in the nerdy academic world we call embodied motivated processing. That's just a fancy way of saying the motivational and emotional processes that are driving attention and memory. To measure those, that's where psychophysiology comes in handy. Biometric measures in the industry world. Which, by the way, the advertising industry has figured out with neuromarketing. Any of you here in neuromarketing? That's the advertisers figuring out we better understand the brain on advertising with psychophysiological data. And also, I would argue ultimately, ideally, as a journalist, you care about what people walk away from that website remembering. So you probably ought to add that data in as well to see if you're actually producing news that has the social good objective of actually making people smarter about the world around them. As well as remembering those ads on there to make the organizational profitable, right? So here's a short little visual. I'll give you a brief kind of static visual of user experience in the Prime Lab, if you will. Users being defined as participants in our experiments. So we're equipped with psychophysiological measures, heart rate, which is detected off the forearms, just like a standard ECG. Heart rate is a physiological indicator of attention. Psychophysiologists have discovered that as you decide something in your sensory environment is very interesting and you're going to pay attention to it and encode that information into working memory, heart rate slows down across time. Might be opposite of what you think. We're used to equating working harder with heart rate getting faster. Well, what happens is when your brain goes, ooh, that's interesting in my sensory environment, this is an evolutionarily adaptive response, that actually kicks up parasympathetic nervous system activity, which is the branch of the nervous system that slows physiology down and better prepares the organism to take in that information. Not to compare us too much to dogs, but have you ever seen a dog freeze? That's parasympathetic activity. That's encoding. And we have the same response. And heart rate can measure that. Another measure we get in the Prime Lab is skin conductance, measured off the surface of the palm. It's a physiological indicator of how excited or calm people feel in regards to what we're exposing them to in the lab. Skin conductance is a fancy word for saying sweat gland activity. It's sympathetic nervous system activity. It's arousal, if you will. The intensity of the emotional experience. Remember, I made a point about engagement a minute ago and how I think the industry defines it descriptively as behavioral engagement? I'm going to give you my definition of brain engagement. Brain engagement is physical attention to motivationally relevant information in the environment. Physical attention to motivationally relevant information in the environment. I'm defining it as a brain process. And I can measure that brain process in the lab with those two measures I just told you about, heart rate and skin conductance. And I can measure engagement in real time on an instant-by-instant basis as an individual experiences your web content and track it. Another physiological measure we get is facial EMG. It's measurement of facial muscle activity in the face involved in expressing positive and negative emotion. So with heart rate and skin conductance, I can tell you something about engagement of web content. With facial EMG, I can tell you how they're feeling about that web content, positive and negative, in terms of user experience. Then, when you bring in eye tracking data, this graph over here, that's kind of what a raw physiological signal looks like. Then when you combine that with eye tracking data, like we can in the lab, you have the ability to what I call close the brain loop and index everything from visual perceptual attention to online cognition and emotion to memory and attitudes. The whole chain. Sounds like a pretty rich data stream to me. And combine that. And then when you bring in web analytics on top of that, then you've got the how, the why, and the what that experience is producing. So, because I didn't want to get through this without talking about any kind of concrete research, I'll tell you what we already know. What we already know about the brain based on research done in our lab as well as other labs like the lab we have at the School of Journalism here. Here's some brain rules that you can take away with you today as things we already know about how the brain experiences media, and some brain facts that have implications for the design of effective media content. First and foremost, we know that the brain is a motivated processor. Emphasis on motivated. What that means is that the first and foremost mission of the brain is to immediately determine the motivational significance of any information in the sensory environment. News provides a great opportunity for that because news is chock full of motivational significance that varies across content and presentation styles. And the interesting thing we're finding is that basically these kind of biologically based motivational systems involved in approaching and avoid stimuli in an environment fundamentally drive a lot of online media use. One of the things that I did for an RJI fellowship a couple years ago is we conducted a large national online survey, 1,200 individuals aged 18 to 70. And we used a measure that's been developed that indexes individual differences in just a natural tendency to engage in approach-related behavior versus a more cautious disposition to avoid novel stimuli. Then on that same survey, we asked people their media preferences for different kinds of features of online news specifically. Big findings that emerged: your mobile news audience really is pretty intuitive. But your mobile audience, those are your approachers. Those are the people who are naturally driven to sensation seeking, far more than your avoiders. And one thing I will say this, that when I was analyzing that data, that came as just a little bit of a surprise, because one thing that I was thinking through as I was looking at this data set is that one thing that mobile media does enable an individual to do is being more alert of possible threats in their environment. Because you're carrying your smartphone with you. In fact, MU is pushing the mobile alert system, that if some kind of emergency occurs on campus, they can send out that alert over smartphones. So mobile seems to be a technology that might enable you to more successfully monitor threats in your environment. And so that would lead to the hypothesis that actually your avoiders would be more inclined towards mobile use. But it was the opposite. It was the opposite. The approach-driven individuals were the ones who had a significantly higher preference for getting news on mobile. And to give an example of how these kinds of findings play out into optimizing design, that has all kinds of implications for the effective design of mobile content. Because the kinds of content, the kind of presentation of content that's going to capture and grow and sustain an audience that is primarily consisting of approach-driven people is going to be very different than the kind of content that's going to do that for your avoid-driven people. One thing it tells you, just at a blunt level, is if it bleeds, it leads. Probably ought to apply more to mobile than desktops. Because that's what those approachers are going to be drawn to. Sensationalized content. Graphic content. That gives them that novel sensory experience. That's what their biological system is driving them towards. And that's how that information ought to be designed for them effectively. Second brain fact that we know is the brain is a contextual processor. Remember earlier I said that people obviously don't come to your website as a blank slate? That's part of this fact, is that they're bringing all kinds of past experiences, past memory, knowledge of the world, cultural values, all that baggage we all carry around with us. That's part of it. That's part of the brain being a contextual processor that shapes how individuals are going to respond to information on your website. But it also occurs even on an instant-by-instant basis as that individual is on your website. Because, remember I said the brain is not a linear processor? And media use is dynamic. It's a dynamic interaction. Basically what that means, one way we've tried to parse that apart in our research is drawing a distinction between what we call getting there, which is the experience I have getting to your website, or getting where I've landed. From the experience, let me go back. Amanda, can you help me? Sorry. You should never give a professor a clicker. That's all I have to say about that. While she's doing that, I think I can talk through some of this. So, there's this experience of getting there versus being there, which is obviously, when I'm on the site that I wanted to seek out, or that I've landed on, as well as processes involved in what we'd call leaving there, going to something else. And what that means is every single bit, literally bit, of sensory information that's coming at that individual in that process of getting there, being there, and leaving there is driving what their brain does, is driving behavior. And it's driving what they walk away from your website with. Can I go backwards? Thank you. Third and final one is we know that the brain is a limited capacity processor. Might be running into that right now with this talk, right? By the laughs, thank you for the empirical validation. Means what it says. The brain obviously isn't a video recorder. Doesn't make a snapshot of things. There's a trade-off between encoding, storage, and retrieval as an individual interacts with content on the website. And different kinds of features of every kind of content you can put on a website, video, audio, text, pictures. Every kind of content can influence how attention shifts between encoding, storage, and retrieval, which, by the way, are processes that are going on in a nonlinear function simultaneously as an individual experiences your website. I would argue, I have to talk a little bit from the advertising perspective, because the thing I've avoided telling you thus far is I'm actually an advertising professor. So I'll make an advertising point here. I would say that limited capacity is the brain fact behind this phenomenon in the advertising industry called banner ad blindness, where advertisers ought to be very upset that their money spent placing banner ads on websites is only getting banner ad blindness rather than banner ad brain engagement. The advertising industry ought to be up in arms about that, folks. So, where's this headed? Here's my advertising professor pitch. Seeking partners to engage in creative science on the brain, on media. I think this combined approach is extremely promising. But here's where I admit to you, I've not empirically validated it. I don't have the case studies yet. Emphasis on yet. But we're seeking partners, because I think there are some very, very, very big, important questions about user experience that can be answered by combining these data streams that get at the how and the why. Thank you. And I think we've got 15 minutes for questions.